All right, everyone, we'll just make a quick start. I'll give you a quick introduction for our speaker today, which is Dr. Greg Moore. What can I say about Greg? He's been around for a long time doing lots of good stuff, and we were just chatting about the work that he did when the tunnels went through under the Yarra, and he saved a whole lot of trees, and he then told me that he didn't even get paid for all that work. So, and one good thing was that it was actually at the time of Jeff Kennett. And apparently Jeff said, I don't want another disaster like Albert Park, so can you do something? So there you go. What a great story that is. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Jeff. He's going to give us Greg, to talk about the future of trees in Melbourne.
Okay.
Thank you, Greg.
Now I'm going to clip this on. Just make sure. Can you hear me? Yep, yes. We're all set, good. I don't usually use a microphone unless I have to, but I will today. Okay, so I'm going to get into this. Do trees have a future in Melbourne? Do the trees of Melbourne have a future? Yes, they do. So we'll get all the sad part, no angst on this. Okay, you know that it's going to have a reasonably good end. So what I'm going to talk about, I've got a few topics that I'm going to mix and match. And the first one I wanted to point out is that when you're talking about urban trees, we expect a lot of them. Now, most people sort of don't think about that, but we want them to be stress tolerant, we want them to be environmentally and climatically adaptable to various conditions. They've got to be good for various soil types because urban soils are really the worst types of soils you can get. They're absolute shockers. We want them to be tolerant of restrictive space because we never give them enough space. And in case you don't know it, there's an absolute war taking place across Melbourne at the present time for the space below ground. And it's not a battle that most of you would be aware of, but everyone wants the space below ground, and of course by taking that space they don't want any trees in that ground. Give you a simple example. Where was the sewerage line in your property? Almost certainly in the backyard. Now have you looked at all these new estates, great big houses, tiny little blocks? Where is all the stormwater and sewage going? In the front, because the utilities can't get to the back. So now the nature strip trees in those estates are all under threat. So you've got to fight for this space. And it's as I said, it's a fight that not a lot of people don't realise. We also want them to be tolerant of limb breakage and severance. So I'd like you to think for a second about this hypothetical, folks. You're working for the local council and they want you to pick a street tree. Now, you've all been critical of council and their street tree choices, haven't you? Okay, at some stage. But have you thought how difficult it is? And I'm going to ask you to think about this in a second or two. So, whether they're X-current means a nice compact conical tree as an adult, or D-current, which means spreading, what we want is we want the young trees to be X-current, because that's what we want in a street. And then when they get to a certain size, we want them to change. So, you know, that's our first requirement. What we want to have a dense canopy of lateral branches with a single trunk. Sound familiar? Get any little kid in primary school and they draw that. Round circle, lots of green, single trunk. That's what people want. How do we know it? Because we actually have folks at the uni that have gone out and asked people what they want of a tree, and they essentially want a lollipop tree. You know, it hasn't changed. And we want a rounded sort of spreading canopy. Now, then we want them to be tall but not too tall, straight and single trunked, tolerant of environmental stresses, pests and diseases, urban pollutants and regular pruning, neat and tidy with minimal soil disturbance and infrastructure damage, free of shedding of flowers, fruits, foliage and bark, and we want them to be maintenance free. Okay, that's all we want. Okay, so when you've got your tree, you let me know which one ticks all of those boxes. Not easy, not easy. So do urban trees have a future? Of course they do. But there are other problems. So what you find is that the lifespans of urban trees decrease as you approach the hub of the city or the various hubs of the city. So if you approach the CBD, if you approach the hub out at Box Hill, then the life of the trees diminish. And this is a worldwide phenomenon, by the way. So it's not an Australian thing. Trees live longer the further they are from the heart of a city. It's probably like us, actually. We've got a fair chance of living longer if we're not too close to the centre of the city, although some of you probably live around here. Sorry to break the bad news. Now, the goal is to have trees to live for 50 to 100 years. And you'll see why that's got to be the goal. Now, you should be able to get more than 100 years out of them if you do well. And you know there are trees very close to here that are over 100 years old, right? There's a couple just out there that I saw before, and there's a couple over at the uni and so on. And what you find is and we don't have a lot of data in Australia, but we do have it, and it's consistent with what they've done in the United States. Very few trees survive much more than 40 years. And that's a big problem. A really big problem. The other thing about trees is that they often die in the first 2 to 5 years, okay? And often when they die, it's not a problem of human beings. It could be that there's a drought. It could be they get hit by pests and diseases. It could be that it was a poor specimen, all of those sorts of things. But what happens is once you get past that time, there's a second peak in tree mortalities at 30 years. And that's almost always due to us, human beings. Why do they die then? Because we've removed them for various reasons. Roadworks, utilities, housing developments and so on. So that second peak is a problem. And at about 30 years, that's when trees really become important assets. You'll see what I mean by that in a second. We can get longer lifespans. So, for example, in Berlin, the average age of the trees is over 60. And you might say, how come? Well, there were no trees in Berlin after World War II. No trees at all. They were all used during the war. And so we know they were planted after the war, and they're still going strong now, close to 70 years, 80 years later. And there's no reason to suspect they don't have many more decades in front of them. So if you've been to Berlin, you'll have seen those trees and you know what I mean. Now, the other thing about trees, and this is quite topical in many ways this week, you probably know that trees are important carbon sequestration organisms. They really do take in a lot of carbon. But the thing is, it takes about 25 to 30 years before your average urban tree, big one, council sort of tree, not the little one you put in the garden or you might plant out here out of a tube, that takes about 25 to 30 years before they become carbon positive. And many people haven't thought about that. Where were those trees? They were in a nursery. Energy was used. They're in containers. They have a potting medium. It's sterilised. Someone's spending a lot of time working on them. Then they're put on a truck. They're brought out into the street. There's a great big digger that comes and digs a great big hole. You know, all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot of carbon that goes in. And so if you lose those trees before that 25 to 30 years, they've never had a chance to sequester to get into the positive. They haven't had enough time. They're sequestering all the time, but it takes about that time. So one of the situations here is when we plant trees, we have to be looking at getting 50 to 100 years out of them. Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense. And to be losing trees at 30 years is environmentally sort of unsustainable, but economically, it's absolutely ludicrous. You spend all of the money, all of the resources, and you don't recoup any of the benefits. And that's a very common phenomenon in cities, and it's certainly one of those observations that can be made about Greater Melbourne. Okay, now I know that you've been an action group. You've defended this park in the past, and you're probably still defending it in various ways. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about this state government, and you probably know what's coming. You look at utility services, okay, power lines in particular. We could save a lot of canopy and a lot of trees. We could prolong their life if we had a different power line clearing regulation regime. So what I've always found it fascinating. I've spoken many times on this. It's interesting that in Victoria, until very recently, the biggest source of CO2 in our state has been electricity generation, okay, because we use an inefficient brown coal. And then who sort of prunes the bits off the trees? The power distribution companies. So they're producing the carbon and then they're chopping down the things that sequester the carbon. And no one says anything. Doesn't that seem a bit bizarre? I mean, wouldn't you? You'd need a John Cleese and he'd get hold of that and he'd make it look as ridiculous as it is. So you can do a lot. So, and the thing is, you want safe and secure electricity. Now, as climate change takes place, what we're going to find is that there are a different set of risks that apply. So you might say, we want safe electricity, we want a certain supply. Everybody wants that, and I certainly want that. My children want it, my grandkids want it. So what's up for debate? The extent of regulation is certainly up for debate. The clearance spaces required around trees is certainly up for debate. And the quality of pruning that takes place around trees is certainly debatable. So in South Australia, climate change, and I'll talk about South Australia again in a minute or two, climate change is sort of really big on the agenda of the state government. Our state government, by contrast, is sleepwalking into climate change in urban areas, absolutely sleepwalking. So what they've done over there is they changed their power line regulations in low voltage, LV, in low bushfire risk, LBRAs. See, I know all the acronyms. Okay, I can run them off. Not because I particularly wanted to, but because of sort of unpleasant experiences with government bureaucracies. So they've reduced the clearance spaces for over a decade, nearly 15 years. In Victoria, I was a part of this group called the Electrical Line Clearing Consultative Committee. You only have a committee like that in a government bureaucracy. Who would think to call a committee the ELCCC? Okay. Anyway, and it consisted of representatives like me, tree people, all of the power distribution companies, of course, they were the majority, local government, city, local government, country, and some rural representatives. Now, this committee's been around for a long time, a couple of decades. I was only on it for a short time, okay, even shorter than I could have been, as you'll see. So they all got together on this committee and we made a recommendation. Last year, the 5-year review of the regulations was up and a working group recommended that the clearance space around low voltage lines in LBRAs go from 1 metre, which is about that, to 300 millimetres, the same as in South Australia, okay? And what happened was Energy Safe Victoria opposed it and then the government came out and opposed it. And the thing is, there is no evidence whatsoever of a fire starting from low voltage in an LBRA. That doesn't happen, okay? So, Victorian government, why are they terrified? Partly because of Black Saturday, okay? That's part of it, the heritage. They're absolutely worried that if something went wrong, they would be held to account. Thing is, something is wrong. And they will be held to account because there's not going to be any bushfires from this, okay? But someone who's clearing around one of those power lines could become electrocuted. There's your first chance of a victim. And the second, by reducing the canopy cover, you run or increase the risk of heatwave related deaths. So what I'm telling you here, and this is incontrovertible, on the chance, the very remote chance that something might happen in an LBRA situation, our government won't act, thereby ensuring that in future there is likely to be an electrocution, last one was in 2019, or there's going to be an increase in deaths in a heat wave. That does not make sense. That does not make sense. This is the difference. So this is the current, this is the reduced. Okay, now in fact, what happened in South Australia? They went to 300 millimetres, canopies got bigger, power lines are rubbing up and down against trees. Do you know what happened? Nothing. So do you know what they decided to do? Not prune them. Good heavens, why would they do that? Save millions. And much greater canopy cover. Why isn't that happening here? Why isn't that happening in Victoria? It's not good enough. So all I'm pointing out to you is that these regulations are no longer fit for purpose. We had the chance to change them last year. If we changed them, there would have been an immediate increase in canopy cover, and the benefits of that canopy cover would be in the order of $1 billion. Now you might be saying, who cares? Well, the thing is, lots of people should care, because if these regulations had been changed, people wouldn't be using their air conditioners as much in summer, their electricity bills would be lower, our power consumption would be decreased. There are a whole range of benefits, and these have been calculated by others, not by me, and if you want to find out how they've worked that out, the information is readily available. You go to the TreeNet website, you click on a link there called Make Victoria Greener, and it will tell you what's happening. Now, in a postscript to this, I was at the meeting where the government said we're not going to accept these, where the Energy Safe said we're not going to accept it. So I looked at this, I said to them, I don't believe you followed due process. I can no longer contribute constructively to this committee, and I got up and walked out, and I haven't been back. Now you might be saying, well, isn't that a good thing for you to do? Didn't matter, because the government decided, having got information they didn't like, they shouldn't have an ELCCC, so it doesn't exist from the 1st of July. Okay, so they got rid of it just a few months after I left, and because you're Victorians, they said, you had a committee and they suggested something we didn't like, so we're not going to have a review in 5 years' time. The next review will be in 10, and they put it in the legislation. So how's that for childish sort of retribution? I think it's pretty impressive myself. Okay, so that's got that off my chest. Okay, and whenever I talk about that, by the way, it doesn't matter whether you're town or country. What's going on with trees and power lines is really sort of loathed by the local citizens. You might be interested to know that country people all around the state know that low voltage lines in LBRAs are not at risk, and so they're not happy that their trees are being felled along these roads, out in the middle of nowhere, in the main streets of towns, clearance and so on, for no good reason. Okay, now let's get on to climate change, because it is going to impact on the trees of Melbourne. When I talk to people about these sorts of topics, I often sort of interact with the audience afterwards in particular, and you find out what people know, what they're not certain about, and what they don't know. And the first thing I can tell you is, for the last, not quite 10 years, but for the last, say, 7 years, almost everyone understands that it's going to get warmer. Prior to about 2008, or 10 thereabouts, people didn't know. You'd often, you all knew, but a lot of people didn't. And so they don't understand the implications of that warmer weather, by the way. But if you've got a raised atmospheric temperature, even by half or 1 or 1.5 degrees, what does that mean? A lot more energy. There's a lot more energy in the climatic system. What the heck does that mean? Stronger winds, more storms, cyclones moving further south. Are cyclones going to get us in Melbourne? No, not in the predictable future. But will they come into Brisbane? Yes. Was the cyclone that hit Brisbane earlier this year completely, where did that come from? They've been warned for 20 years by climate change scientists that cyclones would move further south, eventually getting to Brisbane and probably moving into northern New South Wales. Okay, 20 years, what did they do? Bugger all. Okay, what did the federal governments do? Nothing. So that's what the implication of a warmer atmosphere is. We are going to have storm events more regularly in Victoria. We're going to have stronger winds on a much more regular basis. The winds are going to come from the east and the southeast. If you've got big trees, if the winds are blowing from the west and the north, they'll probably be okay. As soon as they turn around to the east or the southeast, a little bit of a worry. Why? Because a tree's root system acclimatises or grows in relation to the forces upon the tree. And you normally have 60% of the roots on the windward side. And the windward side for us in the past has been to the north or the northwest. Now, Does that mean we're always going to have a trouble with winds from the east and the southeast? No. Because when they come from the southeast, if the tree gets a little bit of a stress and there's a bit of a tug on the root, what do the tree roots automatically do? Produce more roots, new roots. Okay? So over time, trees are wonderful physicists. They understand how to develop the roots to adjust to those forces. So they will adjust over time, but in that period of adjustment, which could be 10, 15 years, you are going to expect some major storms and some significant trees falling over. It's inevitable. Rainfall. Rainfall is going to diminish by about 10%. Because the rainfall will be in the warmer months, then the effective precipitation will probably go down by around 12 to 15%, simply because when the rain falls at this time of the year, more of it evaporates away before it can be used. So that's going to be the effect there. There will be flash flooding. And in case you're sort of thinking about this, you all remember the climate wars? I noticed Tony Abbott put his head up during the week. He's written a book, okay, but he hasn't written a book about bloody climate wars. So the climate wars, you might think, well, we did nothing. But have you thought about what the cost of doing nothing was? 20 years they argued about it. They did nothing. Well, if you want to know what the cost is, have a look at your house insurance premium. Have a look at your house insurance premium. They could easily have spent a few million, roughly 10 million a year for 10 years, would have basically put flood mitigation controls into place right round Australia. Because climate change wasn't a real thing for them, they didn't do it. And of course, you know what's happened in Victoria up north, right through New South Wales. So the costs of it have been enormous. The future costs will be also significant. Now, if you think of Melbourne, is Melbourne a green and leafy city? No, never has been. Okay, predominantly it's not a green and leafy city. How do we know? We know that 19 of the local government areas that make up Melbourne have a canopy cover of under 20%. That is not green and leafy, okay? It's problematic. And so one of the themes of today would be, if you've got trees on private and public land, you want to protect them. You really want to look after them. And of course, you know that what's happening in Melbourne at the present time is that the canopy cover on council-owned land is more or less stable. More or less stable. So where are the decreases in canopy cover occurring? On private land. And they are significant decreases on private land. So we've got to try and preserve what we've got. So how current are we? You know that 2 or 3 weeks ago, the federal government released its climate change impact report. Do you remember that? It made the news cycle, got in there for half a day, maybe a day, before some other salacious nonsense got in there. So, the same day as the government released that, did you notice that the state government allocated $9.5 million to planting 500,000 trees in the west of Melbourne? Did you pick up on that one? Yeah, it's interesting, same day. What a coincidence. Do you believe that? No. Of course it wasn't a coincidence. What happened is the federal government said, we're going to release this report, and you know, Victoria doesn't look that bloody flash. You might want to do something to diffuse it. What are we going to do? We'll spend $9 million planting trees in the west of Melbourne. That'll be a headline, and it was. Worked. Brilliant. Okay, so what did the federal government say? It said urban flooding and its impact on real estate is going to be quite significant in most of the major cities. Heatwave related illness and deaths are going to go up. That's why you'd put 500,000 trees in the west of Melbourne, by the way. Not because of flooding, but because of this one. Impacts on general health and health costs are going to go up. That would be significant in the west. The livability of a city and children's development will be affected. The current costs of climate change in action are massive, and these costs will continue to rise. That's what the federal government said in a fairly sombre, but I think most people would say conservative report. Okay, they weren't really sort of running around saying the sky is falling. So, I've mentioned Adelaide a couple of times, and you may wonder why. Adelaide, in many ways, is the canary in the coal mine for climate change. Are you aware of that? Yeah, it's worth thinking about. And you can work out pretty quickly why. It's a bit further north than us, okay? It's got a slightly warmer climate, it's got a lower rainfall, okay? So if climate change hits them, it hits hard. And the state government in South Australia is worried that Adelaide is going to have some 50-degree summer days. Okay, 50-degree summer days. Now, when a city starts to experience 50-degree summer days, the livability of the city is threatened. Did you know, for example, that the air conditioners that we in Australia use are only rated to 45C? So once the temperature goes up above 45C, their performance and their reliability cannot be guaranteed. So this is a big worry in a place like Adelaide. And what they found in Adelaide is that the canopy, in South Australia, is that the canopy of Adelaide had diminished by 11% in a decade, and they were losing 75,000 trees per annum. Much worse here in Melbourne, okay? You think of a couple of projects, the tunnel for the Westgate Tunnel, the North East Link project, you've got over 50,000 to 60,000 trees just in those two projects, not talking about all the others. So we're much worse. And so as a consequence of that, one of my expectations, sadly perhaps a prediction, is that sometime within the next 5 to 10 years, there will be a heat wave that kills somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people. That will be catastrophic for the city where it occurs. Where is it likely to happen? Well, it could be in Adelaide. Probably not in Canberra because the population number is not great enough. Could be Melbourne, possibly Sydney. Possibly Sydney. Definitely won't be in Perth because they don't keep data on heatwave related deaths. So they're okay over there. So fairly sobering. So some of you might be saying, well, where did you get that number from? Why did you pick 500 to 1,000? So first and foremost, you all are familiar with the urban heat island effect, UHI or UHIE. If you're not, you should actually write the acronym down. I've seen it in the paper. Herald Sun, believe it or not, scientific journal. Urban heat island effect. And what it means is when you've got lots of tar and cement in buildings, the temperature is up to, about 3 degrees, sometimes a little more, than the surrounding fringe, the urban fringe. Now that may not sound much, 3 to 4 degrees, but that's enough in a very severe heat wave to turn from very hot conditions to lethal conditions. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing, in Melbourne, the hottest air during a heat wave tends to be in the west of Melbourne, okay, the north and northwest, because the canopy cover is the lowest, of course. Now, you might say, well, the governments did say, well, it's in the west. How many swinging electorates are there in the west? None. So if a few people in the west die, who cares? I come from the west, by the way, and I am being a bit sort of mischievous. Not very. But the interesting thing is, under most Melbourne weather patterns, the hot air of the day moves to the east of Melbourne overnight. Now that's a problem. You're into volatile electorates, okay, and it's the hot night air temperatures that kill you, not the daytime temperatures. So it's the nighttime temperatures that are really important. So what this headline here says, and I've mentioned the prestigious Herald Sun as a scientific journal. A friend of mine rang me a number of years ago now, about 8 years ago, and he said, "You're not going to believe it, there's something on climate change in the Herald Sun." And of course I didn't believe it. I thought it was a joke. So he said, no, I'm serious. You better get a better look at this. So I went out and I looked for it, and here it is. But you'll notice it's on page 23. This is the first time they'd sort of admitted climate change might be actually happening. So it was a really important article. And the sub-editor has had fun. Tree breeze blows. Leafy suburbs keep cool in the shade, sweltering west green with envy. It's a really good sort of bit of journalism. When you read the article, do you know what it actually says? It says, in the future, in Melbourne's climate change scenario, people are going to die in the west. That's it, just says it. Doesn't say we should do something about it. Doesn't suggest anything to change, it just says that's what's going to happen. okay? It's really quite brutal, okay? And this is 8 years ago. What's happened in 8 years? Nothing. Nothing. And are 500,000 trees and 9.5 million that were suggested 2 weeks ago going to make a difference? No, not really. Not really, and you'll see why in a minute. So, I've been talking now for about 35 minutes, and some of you have probably had lunch, you're probably starting to get a little bit snoozy, feeling it's a lovely day, you should be out in the garden, that's where I want to be, that's where I'm going to be when I leave here. And I want you to have some take-home messages, simple take-home messages. And I'm going to test you on them in a second. You ready for it? Sort of be ready for the questions. So, the first thing I wanted to say is that 30% is an arboricultural magic number. 30%. What do I mean by that? In Australia, if you have a forest, you have to have a tree canopy cover of 30% or greater. That's the definition that we use in a forest. How long have we used that definition? Decades and decades, at least 70 years, probably longer. It's not the same definition worldwide. The Brits regard 20% as a forest. Some places as low as 15%. It's not really a forest in my view. But we use 30%. A colleague of mine, when she was doing her PhD study on the value of trees to a property, what she found in Brisbane is the value or the amount that people were prepared to pay for a house and a block of land went up and up and up as the tree canopy cover went up till you got to 30% and then it dropped. Now what that tells you is people want trees on their house blocks but they don't want too many. I reckon that's pretty sensible, to be honest. And the other thing we know is that to gain the greatest benefits of urban trees, you require a canopy cover of 30%. So what you find is as your canopy cover goes up, the benefits go up, and then it levels off. That's the law of diminishing returns, isn't it? At about 30%. You can get more benefits for more cover, but you've got to work really hard and you don't get much extra benefit. So, if someone says, what should the canopy cover of your suburb, town or city be, you would all cry out? 30%. Thank you. Take home message number 1. Second one. Oops, wrong button. There's a new rule that some of you may have heard of, but many perhaps not. This is called the 3-30-300 rule. And those of you that have watched Pirates of the Caribbean may remember a certain character played by Jeff Rush who said, when questioned about one of the things that pirates did, he said, more a guideline than a rule. This is more a guideline than a rule, okay? And I'm not going to do the impersonation. I do the impersonation for my kids. So, what does it say? It says that a person has the right to see 3 trees from their home, live in a home where the canopy cover is 30%, suburb in other words, and live within 300 metres of a park. That is the 3-30-300 rule. Now, it's a planning guideline, and I can tell you now, no state government in Australia would be keen to adopt it. And you can see why, right? No one. Local government, different matter. Many of the local governments are aware of this and are interested. State government planning rules, not going to have a bar of it. They will fight this to the death. So, this should be the target that we use. And the question you're going to ask is there any real data and science behind these things? And the answer is yes, there's lots. Lots and lots and lots of it. Now, it doesn't... What happens if you can only see 2 trees? Yeah. What happens if there's 4? Great. So they've picked the 3. 30% canopy cover, there's over 30 years of research on that. Within 300 metres, lots of studies have said that you need to live within 400 metres or half a kilometre and so on. So the numbers are sort of around those numbers. They're not necessarily absolutely on those numbers, but there is a lot of science behind this. And this is gaining momentum in other parts of the world, such as Canada, parts of Europe, and yes, even in some states of the USA. I won't tell you which ones. Now, let's get into some of the direct benefits of this and why this is important and why that 30% canopy cover, and the 330-300 rule is important. This is a major study that was done a few years ago now in North America, and it was called The Effect of Greenness on Women's Health in North America. Greenness is what we would call treed green space or treed parks. Okay, that's what they mean. And I won't go through, this is a mega data study, so what they've done is they've taken loads and loads of research papers and put them all together and then done a very sophisticated statistical analysis. And the data on this is particularly strong. And these are about correlations, not cause and effect, about correlation. So what did they find in relation to greenness and women's health? Well, first and foremost, they found that women who lived in green and leafy places had lower heat wave mortality rates. Their babies had higher birth rates. They used fewer prescription drugs. If they had to go to hospital, there were fewer complications. They stayed for a shorter time and they recovered more quickly. They were more resilient. They lived longer, which won't surprise you. And there were other things such as there were better learning outcomes for their kids, seemed to be lower levels of domestic violence and violence in general. So what you found is overall there was a much improved overall general health when they were in green and treed locations. Now when you look at this, a couple of things sort of become obvious. The first and foremost is that the benefits there are not worth tens of millions of dollars to the Australian economy or even hundreds of millions of dollars. They're worth billions each year. Billions of dollars each year. And so we're not talking about something that doesn't have an impact on everyday life or on the economic side of the society we live in. This is fundamental to the livability and sustainability of our cities. It's really important stuff. The other thing to know is that there is a lack of equity in green space, and this is a phenomenon that occurs worldwide, not just in Australia, but it certainly happens in all of the major Australian cities. So what you find is that different parts of cities have different access to green space, and as a consequence the urban heat island effect is different. So you won't be surprised to learn, as we said earlier, hotspots are out in the west to the north of Melbourne. There's one little hotspot down near Dandenong. And this sort of phenomenon happens over and over again. And what we know is that access to space is really sort of, green space is significant because it impacts on so many other aspects of the lives of the people who live there. But it's much more complicated than I might have been leading you to believe. We know, for example, that there are compounding factors. So I said these were correlations, very high correlations, very strong positive correlations, but you know that the people who live in treed green space are going to be from a higher socio-economic group. They'll be better educated. All of those things contribute to some of the sort of factors that we talked about. So it's not as simple as just sticking the trees and things will change. Or is it? Or is it? And we'll talk about that in a second. So what you tend to find is that people who live where there are fewer trees are from a socio-economically disadvantaged background, and the accessibility to green space should be a right. And the paradox is obvious. The sectors of a society that need the treed green space have least access to it. Okay. Now, how is this used in other parts of the world? In other parts of the world, they look at maps, and they do that. They've done this here in Victoria. They look at a map and they say, that's a lower socioeconomic status area. How can we improve it? We'll plant some trees. They do plant trees. Can you all see the catch-22? You know what's going to happen, don't you? What's going to happen if you plant the trees? The suburb starts to green up. Then what happens? Real estate value goes up. Okay, but do they actually plant the trees as a part of sort of social engineering to minimise disadvantage? Yes, they do, and it works. It actually works. It virtually never happens here in Australia. and it's something you should think about. By the way, we got a lesson in this during COVID. Victoria, lockdowns, most anywhere, okay? Many of you not thinking fondly of that particular period, but there was some civil disobedience. Do you remember? The government not impressed with certain people. Well, here's the government. Gets out there, says you can go out for recreation in a park within 5k of your home. And you all go, beauty, not a problem here, okay? What about the poor buggers that looked at the map and said, oh, there isn't a park within 5k of our home? So what did they do? They broke the curfews. Civil disobedience? No, absolutely necessity. And it was very interesting when you looked at where things weren't going well during those lockdowns. They were almost all in places where there was less green space and fewer trees. Okay, so I've been moving along at a fairly brisk pace, and I'm going to go just a little bit further. One of the things I was asked to speak about today was the future of trees in Melbourne. And I've already told you there is going to be a future for them. They're much more resilient than you think, much more resilient than you think, and there may be a few losses. So, for example, you're probably not going to see that many silver birches around in the Melbourne area. Okay, we're right at the edge of their tolerance range for high temperatures. You might see a few good ones up in the hills and up at Mount Macedon. But other trees will do well, and I want to just give you a snapshot, a glimpse of what I'm talking about here. And you probably know that in relation to great urban trees, and you're thinking of things like elms because of where we are, oaks, plane trees, and various others. They are great urban trees, and there are a whole range of things that make them great urban trees. They're really resilient, they grow in a wide range of soils and climates, they're really tough, they're relatively low maintenance, all that sort of stuff. But what about Australian species? Well, for the most part, there's been very little research. If you look at the elms, for example, we know that they've been bred and selected for urban use for over 500 years. We know that the Romans were fiddling around with plane trees 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And they were really good at sort of digging them up, moving them around, planting them as mature specimens. Labour wasn't a problem for the Romans. Slaves, in case you're wondering. So, what about Australia? A little bit of work done on spotted gum. Okay, that was with me and one of my students. Lophostomen convertus, another Burnley person. Tristaniopsis larina, one of the staff at Burnley. Most of the studies from an urban tree perspective that have been done on natives have some Burnley connection, or did until recently. Yellow gum, do you all know yellow gum, Eucalyptus leucoxylon? Great tree, native to Victoria, doesn't come as far south as Melbourne, but it's got a lovely bright flower, and it's one that we've already planted widely across Melbourne, and it grows very well. Typically it's a small to medium tree, around 13 metres, can get up to 30 metres in the forest form, but does that very rarely in a city. It's smooth, lovely trunk, some of you will know it, and it has flowers that range from white to red. Not surprisingly, you all guessed it, the pink and the red ones are the ones that everyone loves. Okay, white doesn't rate. And what you find is it's widely planted and grows pretty well. Now, we talked about what makes it a really good urban tree a bit earlier. So we want to know, how well does it grow? What's its height? How does it look? Does it do all the things that I mentioned very early on? Is it a tree with a single trunk? It doesn't get too tall, starts off like this, goes like that, nice flower colour, all those requirements. And so this is what we wanted to do. We wanted to develop arboricultural criteria that we could assess these trees against, and that would allow us to pick out the best of them in Melbourne, because there's some really good ones and there's some really tatty ones growing around the place, and you'd only propagate from the really good ones. That makes sense. So we've done all this work. And I'm not going to show you all the data, because that's not to be done on a Saturday afternoon on such a lovely day. But we looked at over 300 trees, and we've got data on all of them. And what we found is that they do very well. So here is a eucalypt that does very well as an urban tree. And it will do well under changed climate conditions. We need to get the best quality plants we can, but it has great potential for use as an urban tree, not just in Victoria or South Australia where it grows naturally, but right across Australia and, for that matter, potentially the world. It could be one of those great urban trees as climate changes. Now, we always think of the great urban trees as being exotics, okay? And I'd like to challenge you. Do you have a problem with one of our trees being seen as a great urban tree in another continent? Should that happen? Is it okay? What happens if they're having trouble with species of their own that can't adapt to the climate change that's being inflicted upon them? So there's a whole range of issues to be thought through here. Don't want to make it too simplistic, but you can certainly see this particular tree growing pretty well in, say, California, for example, or maybe in a really difficult part of Africa, perhaps India. Got to watch out for weed potential, of course. So what we find is these trees are good at dealing with the soils and with the climate. They're also good in that they develop a good canopy on a single trunk. Now, that good canopy means that they are very good at cooling and shading when the urban heat island effect has an impact. Trees are much more effective than any other plant form in dealing with the urban heat island effect. And the reason for that is, if you think of a tree, it casts a shadow, right? And that shadow is like an umbrella. So an umbrella shades, doesn't it? So the tree shades. But if there's soil moisture, the tree is pumping water up through it and out through its leaves. And what does that do? It cools all of the air around it. So when you think about trees, you'll notice that I've been using the term shade and cooling, because very often people only think of shade, they forget about cooling. We know that the tree grows well. What we don't know is how well it will grow for, because in Melbourne there is no data on how old these trees are and when they were planted. So just to make a couple of quick observations. This is only one species. How many other eucalypts, how many of the other over 700 eucalypts would perform as well? We've done work on Corymbia maculata, which is a eucalypt spotted gum, and we've also done work on this one. Both measure up very, very well. Now, when I talk to people in the east of Melbourne, they hate, or some of them hate, Corymbia maculata, spotted gum. Have you heard this? Great big trees, shedding bits and pieces, all that sort of stuff. Well, that's because they haven't grown the right ones. The best Corymbia maculata or spotted gum is a thing called Corymbia maculata henryi, or sometimes called Corymbia henryi. And where does it come from? The Mottle Range in Victoria. It's a Victorian version, not the New South Wales version. Now, I don't want to be parochial about this, okay, and I'm not, but it doesn't grow as tall. It has a more spreading, denser canopy and is less prone to what we call codominant stems, which means bits and pieces can fall off. It's got a lot going for it. And can you get it? Yes. There are a couple of nurseries in Melbourne where you can get them. Okay. Now, I'm going to just finish up here. I've got about 4 minutes. Heat waves are the biggest killers of all natural phenomena. You probably know that. Do you all remember that in 2009, on Black Saturday, 173 people died in the fires? We all remember that. 374 people died in the heat wave surrounding it. Most Victorians don't know that when I mention it. Now you can see where I got that 500 to 1,000 people figure from. It's from this. In 2014, there was a heat wave. Do any of you remember that one, 2014? Most people don't. It's about 3 warm nights, 166 people died. So, really big deal. And the simplest, most cost-effective way of cooling a city is by increasing the canopy cover. It's as simple as that. In 2016 at the TreeNet Symposium in Adelaide, and I declare I have an interest in TreeNet, I've been part of them for a long, long time. If anyone's interested, go to their website. It's the second time I've mentioned it. Information, great papers, podcasts, all free. no paywall, no passwords or anything. Just go there. But in this one, the first three speakers of our conference were medical people. And the first one was an epidemiologist. Nobody knew what an epidemiologist was in 2016. We all know now. And what they said was, if you had more treed green space, you could save $800 million a year in relation to type 2 diabetes. And another said, yes, but you could save $4.2 billion a year in relation to cardiac and blood pressure related illnesses. And you think, how could that possibly be? That's $5 billion, more than is spent on every park, garden across Australia, okay? Almost double. And you ask, how could that possibly be? And one of them said, you know, this is not rocket science. If you have treed green space, people will use it. And so these are conditions that related to inactivity and obesity. In other words, exercise. It's as simple as that. And that was the point to be taken from this. So if you now know that you've got this correlation, very strong correlation, between treed green space and diabetes or blood pressure and heat wave related deaths, if you know that and you do nothing, why isn't it negligence? Why aren't you being negligent? And I'm asserting, obviously, that you are. And who am I targeting here? State government. Not local government, because it's the state government planning frameworks and management systems that allow these things to happen. The benefits from trees are enormous. I could go on for hours and hours and hours, anything from 3 days to 3 weeks on any one of those topics. I'm not going to. But I do want to make it clear that, you know, we can work at all sorts of levels. And just to give you a very simple example, I'm going home this afternoon. 2 medium-sized trees in my backyard to the north or to the west will save me something in excess of $200 to $300 a year in cooling costs. Simple as that, just by a little bit of shade. We have to think about this. And I know there are lots of questions that come up. What about my solar panels? Do I get less energy? All that sort of stuff. And I'm ready for those questions should you want to ask them. I'm going to leave it there because my time is up. Any questions? Yeah.
Plane trees.
Yep.
I'm aware of a lady who stood on a conker, which I think she said fell from a plane tree.
Yes.
In a main shopping strip.
Yeah.
I think it was out of the Liddell or
Yeah,
something. And she's made a claim against the council.
Council, yeah.
The question is whether or not it's an appropriate tree to plant in a main highly trafficked shopping area.
Yes.
Any views about
Yeah,
that?
yeah. It is an appropriate tree. I hope
Is or is not?
is. And conker, if it's a hard one, those little sort of points on it, that's probably from a liquid amber. If it's a soft one, furry, that's from a plane tree. People get them mixed up, okay? Because the leaves look a bit different, look a bit the same. So in relation to plane trees, it's fascinating. Until about 20 years ago, plane trees were considered to be one of the great urban trees, indestructible, just fantastic. What we found out during the millennium drought is they weren't quite as indestructible as we thought. Okay, so they're being phased out because there were too many of them planted in certain places. Now here's the drum. Do they cause allergies?
Yes. No.
Almost certainly not.
Really?
Yeah. So they are irritants, but not allergies. So you might ask what the difference is. If you've got an allergy, your autoimmune system responds. You can do a blood test, okay? People say they're allergic to plane trees. Of all the people that I've talked to, only one has ever said they had a positive allergic reaction when tested. And even she wasn't sure that it was to the plane tree, okay? All the others are irritation. What does irritation mean? Planes have silicon on them, okay? And the silicon irritates your nose, eyes, and back of throat for some of you. You might ask, is there a difference between being allergic to and irritated? In the real world, maybe not a big deal, but there is a difference. So that's the first thing. Second thing, plane trees are really great at taking in particulate matter. Particulate matter is very small sort of airborne pollution. It's probably the biggest killer of all the pollutants, and it kills thousands of people. Okay, so do you remember 2019-20 when we had that smoke in Melbourne from the fires? Plane trees would have been doing a corker of a job taking that in. Okay, so it's not all bad news. Now, in relation to fruits, because that's what you're talking about, humanity has made some astonishing inventions, and some of them are not that popular anymore. And I'm talking about the broom and the rake. Need I say more?
No.
Thank you. If you've got a great tree, and I'm not saying these were great trees, but if you've got a great urban tree and it really gets up your goat that it sheds, well, get a bloody life and get a broom. Okay, that's my view. You get all these benefits. I've got time, I suppose. I'll give you a simple example. I know you've got to go. Simple example. Why did I work out how much money you save from an air conditioner at a normal house? The reason was I kept being asked by people, I love trees, but I hate such and such because it sheds stuff and blocks up my roof gutters. Okay, right. All the time I get it. Someone here is probably thinking, I'm glad I didn't ask him that. And the thing is, how much does it cost you to clear your gutters? About $100 for a single story house, about $100. You're going to clear them once a year anyway. If you've got some neighbour's trees that's shedding, you're going to do it twice. So it's costing you $100. And when the gutter cleaner comes, people grab their wallet and they hand over the money. And they hate it. And they hate their neighbour anyway. Okay, so they hate it. So I thought, what happens if that neighbourhood tree is providing shade? So I did some sums, and I haven't shown them to you, but I've got them. And this was run through the ABC fact-checking system to make sure that I wasn't sort of exaggerating. And with over $100, $180 at the time, it'd be $300 now. And the reason I did that was to say to people, well, you hate your neighbour and their tree because they're costing you $100 a year. But you're saving over $200 a year because of their shade. And if you chop the trees down, you'd be worse off. And then if I'm feeling particularly mischievous, I say to the people, perhaps you should be giving your neighbour the $100 a year for their tree. Okay, I'll leave it there. If you need to go, I understand. Yeah, no problems, understood. Any other questions? Yeah, yep.
I'd like to ask you about trees though and planting and water, because within the bounds of the city of Melbourne, where there's been targeting of the need to have many, many more street trees.
Yep.
We've had paulownias, we've had ginkgos.
Yep.
These trees are going into streets and quite narrow streets. At the same time, the council concreted in all the corporation lanes that once used to allow the rainwater to sink down into the soil. And what we're getting is drinking the water, the trees are drinking the water that is beneath our houses.
Ah, well, look, that's a much more complicated issue than you've presented. And you've sort of brought in a number of different points. So I'll try and deal with them separately. The first one, there is a strong movement to keep more water where it falls. Okay, Melbourne City Council certainly onto that. It's happening right across Australia. And if you want to learn detail on that, you go to the TreeNet site that I mentioned before and look up all of the papers, and there's a lot of them, on water sensitive urban design, WSUD. Okay, so that will sort of talk, that's one aspect of it. The second aspect that I'll mention is there's a lot of work done on permeable paving, and Melbourne City Council again, and some of the other big inner councils, well aware of it, and most people wouldn't know the difference between ordinary paving and permeable paving. Okay, it's not obvious. So unless someone actually goes to one of these sites and sort of says, what is that material, you probably won't know that there's a permeable paving there. Now, if you're asking me...
Is it hard surface?
Yes.
A hard surface pattern?
Yeah. As I say, you probably wouldn't know. And some of it can look just like bitumen. And there may be some bitumen in it, but it allows a certain amount of water. And you can specify how much water goes through. If you want to look this up very quickly on the internet, type in the name Tim Johnson. He's one of my students. He lives in Adelaide. initially an engineer, now very much into the tree sort of side of things. And he's done his PhD on it. And I've actually got a paper coming out with Tim next month on soakage pits, which is where you take water from running down the gutter, diverting it into the wells that support street trees. Okay. Now, if you're talking about old houses on soils in this vicinity, much more complicated issue. So, for example, many of the old houses don't have any footings, okay, don't have footings. And prior to the 1983 drought, I think it was, 83 drought, people and engineers across Melbourne, when a house cracked, would say, there's a street tree, that's the culprit. Take the money and walk away. They did very well out of it, and there are still some engineers doing very well out of it today. What happened in that drought is houses cracked where there were no trees. So what does that tell you?
Basaltic soil.
Well, not necessarily basaltic, but a clay, a reactive soil, yeah. And since you know that, you probably know that if they remove the trees and the soil re-wets, what happened to the cracks? They got bigger. So the simple knack of removing the trees didn't work. So, and you probably know the answer to the way to minimise cracking is to keep soil moisture content level. So people are aware of those issues. It's much more complicated than the answer I've given you, but I've given you a bit of an insight. There was another question over here, yeah.
Yeah, I want to know if you know anything about the noisy miners and their effect with the trees.
Yes, it's not my field, but there's lots of good urban ecologists around.
Yeah, because we've got them all here and we didn't have them before. And
yeah, well,
wrecking all the other birds.
Yes, what all the data tells us that they like few trees, grassland. The more shrubs you put in, and the more diverse, the fewer noisy miners you'll
And
have.
it's also a certain type of eucalypt.
No, probably not. It can be.
Well, that's what the Commonwealth report said.
Yeah, well, maybe. But, I mean, there are as I said, 700 species of eucalypt. So I would be suggesting that you'd be much better to look at the understory, and they've done very good work down in Bayside on this. I just can't remember the young bloke's name.
Geo.
Yes, Geo. Have a chat with him. And of course, I won't argue that having a more diverse canopy cover isn't a good thing to do. Because as you probably know, Melbourne, in certain parts of Melbourne, had a much higher density of plane trees, up around 75%, and that's not going to happen in the future. They're going for a 10% maximum for any one species. So you will get more diversity, and you're right, if you're going to be looking at these more complex urban ecosystems, you have to have a much greater diversity. And whilst my interest is in trees, from an ecological perspective, I know, and we all know, that the more complex the ecosystem you have, there's more layers, the better the cooling, the higher the level of carbon sequestration, the better the soil structure. So you get a whole range of other benefits from having a more complex ecosystem.
Not just yellow gums.
I'm not suggesting just yellow gums. And if that's the message you got, was that the message I gave?
You said it could grow all around the world.
Yes, it could. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think you've misunderstood. You've obviously got a particular point that you've honed in on. What I'm saying, and I'm disagreeing with you strongly, okay, just so you know, politely but strongly.
I'm disagreeing.
Yeah, I understood that politely, but I can see from the redness in your face. The thing about yellow gum is it is a native of Victoria. You know that, right?
Yep.
It's a really good tree, and under climate change, we know it will do well as climates dry and temperatures go up. We know that. We have all the data. We know that in some parts of the world, they're going to have very, very few options. So knowing which trees have the potential to be great urban trees, and at the moment, there's only 2 species of eucalypt out of 700 that we know have great urban potential. Only 2.
So in that case, if you want a 10% maximum for any one species, where the other 8 will not even come?
Exactly.
We still have to find them to do it.
For example, I have a feeling, maybe you'll be the one that does it, I think blackwood, which is a wattle, could be one of the great urban trees. How many blackwoods have you got in Melbourne? Very few. We know they grow well.
But they don't last.
200 years? What do you got against 200 years? I would have said if you've got 200 years, and there are blackwoods that are well over 150, okay? Now, if you're talking about silver wattle, I think silver wattle's a great urban tree. Lucky to get 45, okay? But it is a great tree. So I think what I'm suggesting to you is that if you're going to plant trees, you need data. You need data on how they're performing. And we've got virtually nothing on how trees perform. And I would be more, and I have suggested this, I've suggested that the same criteria that I used for yellow gum be used on the exotics. No one's done it. But my suspicion is that plane trees would not do well.
But Greg, you were saying before that you've only looked at 2 out of the 700 you've
Yes.
really, so there's possibly plenty
The potential is enormous.
Yeah.
You know, the potential is enormous, but what I'm saying is Australians exploit our native species. We never look to them for developing.
Actually, another thing, the Melbourne City Council in their plan for trees, a green canopy cover, had a target, I think they said some years ago now, 45%.
Yeah, 40.
Right. Do you have any knowledge of that? Because when
Yeah.
we had one of the council people who had been consulting on doing the trees.
Yes.
He looked at Royal Park and thought, oh, I can get the 40% cover if it still is full of trees. And we're saying, hang on, this is a sort of grassland
Yeah.
area.
Yeah.
So I don't think we've heard anything since.
Melbourne City Council put in a 40% target with the hope that they would reach 30. Okay, so in your lifetime and my lifetime, we don't have to worry. They're not going to get there. Okay.
It's hard at putting trees in here though.
Yeah.
Just dumping them with it.
Oh, well, they shouldn't be dumping them. I mean, your comments before about establishing a proper ecological ecosystem is absolutely valid. And you know you've got a range of species that will do well here. You've got a really good palette to choose from. They shouldn't be dumping things.
But when you do your tree evaluations, do you look at insects or birds when you're doing it? You're just looking at tree. You're just looking at shade and
No.
temperatures.
I am, because that's my expertise. There are a whole lot of other people that are looking at the other things. I mean, I wasn't asked to come and speak about that. I would be happy to do it. So, for example, I've done work on the benefits of sulphur-crested cockatoos in dealing with Romulea rosea, okay? And I consider that to be quite significant because I think the sulphur-crested cockatoos do a great job in dealing with that particular weed species, okay? To my knowledge, it's the only paper that's ever been written from that perspective on it. I've also interested in yellow-tailed black cockatoos in relation to how they interact with urban trees. You're not going to like this because I've been looking at them in relation to conifers, okay? And the interesting thing about, do you want me to tell you about this or not?
Yes.
Okay, in relation to yellow-tailed black cockatoos, you know they're threatened particularly in, well, threatened everywhere, but they're particularly at threat in South Australia. And one of the biggest threats to them is the removal of pines, okay? Because no one wants the pines, they're considered weedy, and when they remove them, they remove the food source for the yellow-tailed black cockatoos because they've cleared all of the other native vegetation, and then the cockatoos don't have the capacity to move between feeding sites. So you don't need continuous band of them, but you need them in certain places. They've got a phenomenal memory, the yellow-tailed black cockatoo, so they know where these trees are. So if you happen to have a pine or various species, not all, but some of the pine species, they will feed on the cones and take the seeds. Big advantage of that?
Spread them.
No, they eat all the seed. So there's no seed left in the cone. So for example, Pinus ponderosa, they absolutely devour the lot and there's nothing left. So it removes the weed potential of that particular species. Pinus radiata, a little bit more complicated because it's serotonous. So it has the capacity of opening and then closing and opening and closing. Ponderosa doesn't have that capacity. So it's a very complex interaction, okay? But these are interactions that you're probably not looking at it on a typical urban street.
So should we be planting more she oaks? Because we cleared them and the
Yes.
cockatoos certainly love she oaks.
Love she oaks.
Not
And
enough brooms in the world.
sorry?
Not enough brooms in the world to sweep
Well,
up the
well, hang on. With she oaks, great thing about she oaks is, yes, we should be. I'm a great she oak fan. You probably know that there was a study done by Kath Williams that said that people don't like she oaks. So if your local council starts planting she oaks, they're going to get a lot of complaints. I actually love them, and I love the fact that they sigh in the wind. A lot of people don't. But I also love the fact that they provide a mulch which basically eliminates weeds. So if you plant them in the right place, in the right way, and with the right understory species, they can be phenomenal plants. Yeah, I agree.
So why do they sporadically die?
They shouldn't.
They shouldn't.
No, they're long-lived. They should be long-lived. But they're also quite fussy. So they often quite deep-rooted. They're very sturdy, but they need to tap into water, and they'll do it one way or the other. So sometimes if you suddenly have one and it dies off almost overnight, it's almost guaranteed that someone's been fiddling with the subterranean water flows. A lot of people do it. In other words, some developer comes in and digs a bloody trench. Yes.
I just noticed on the north side of Broad Park, by the railway cutting, every second of third one is dying. I share a place down on the Surf Coast. We planted it with she oaks, and they've nearly all died after reaching like 15 years.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is people often plant them too close too. So if you plant them too close, the competition. So if you look at some she oak communities, it's almost as if the plants have been planted according to a scheme. They're evenly spaced. And what that tells you is they're exploiting a significant volume of moisture. And if they don't get it, they just die.
I don't know if this is going to make any sense, but looking at a suburb like Tarneet, which I walked through once, there aren't any trees at all.
No.
But would there have been many trees there anyway of the sort to make a difference?
That's a really...
So you'd be actually planting trees that may not want to live there.
Yeah, they may not want to. Look, the problem about those places is they were grasslands.
Yes.
And the basalt grasslands are probably the most endangered EVC in Victoria, less than 0.5%. Okay, so there's not many of them. They were really done over very early in Victorians' history. Victoria, the grassland to the west wasn't as great prior to the Europeans arriving here as it is now. So there was natural grassland, but we expanded it enormously, right? So I'm often asked if those places, because I live out near there and have all my life, so if people ask if you're living out there, you never had trees in the first place, so why would you expect to have them now? Okay, and the answer is a suburb is a suburb. It's no longer a natural site, and the people in the west have all of the things that I talked about earlier apply to the people in the west of Melbourne. They have much shorter lifespans, much higher health costs, a whole range of what I call preventable diseases. And so my argument is that you cannot use the fact that there was no tree species there 2 decades ago to argue against a canopy cover of 30%. But they are. That argument is being waged. There people are saying you can't have 30% canopy cover in the west of Melbourne because it was a grassland. I don't accept that.
Can it do it? Can it produce?
Yeah, the trees...
sustain?
No, not unless you manipulate the environment. But to have people survive, you're going to have to manipulate the environment. When during the heat wave of Black Saturday, 374 people died. The Department of Health reviewed where they died and how they died. And the way they did it is they put little red dots on a map. And to their surprise, the red dots weren't spread across Victoria or spread across Melbourne. they were highly localised, okay? And then they asked, well, what are the correlations that are strongest for those red dots? And the answer was lack of trees and green space. That's the greatest, strongest correlation. So then they said, if we know that correlation and we find other places that have low green space and few trees, why didn't people die there? Okay, good question, right? So they looked at those places and they found that they were a much younger demographic, new estates and the like, right? Then they said, well, what happens to those people when they're older in 30 years' time? And the answer is they'll die. They'll die. Unless we've worked out a way of keeping homes cooler, they'll die. Because in some of those places, there's no capacity for trees. They've got no space.
It struck me too, and this is probably demographics, and that there was a population that weren't gardeners anyway.
Yes. Look, the thing is, this is not about gardening. This is about...
Well, you've planted a tree in your front yard. I put trees in my village here in West Brunswick.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but and I won't disagree. The idea, you know, when I was a kid, my grandmother used to send me up in Kilmore, send me with food to one of the little old ladies that was still around, and you take a meal down once a week. And she was really old then, she's in her 90s, this little old lady. And it never occurred to people that the little old lady with the great garden is the little old lady because she's got a great garden. And she's got a great garden because she spends so much time in it. You know, and that's what all that information is telling you, essentially. So you're right, but the truth of the matter is, this is about planning and planning frameworks. That's what it's really about. Now listen, folks, we've gone way over. We're going to have to call it a day.
All right, well,